Okay, welcome to our lecture material on relationship formation, and this first part is on marriage rates and cohabitation. And so I'll be kind of summarizing some of the findings on cohabitation and marriage rates that we've touched on in lectures and class readings before now, along with kind of the material from this week and other research. So I do have to warn you that when we're talking about marriage rates and cohabitation, the vast majority of the research has been done so far on different gender couples. There is kind of just a small amount of longitudinal data on sexual minority adult formation, especially when we're talking about marriage, and a lot of these data sets aren't very large, and so they don't lend themselves very well to comparison. So it's the responsibility of researchers, it has been in the past and will continue to be in the future, to expand this data and create, gather kind of and create larger data sets. Okay, so we definitely see this theme when we talk about relationship formation of increasing complexity, an uncoupling or a decoupling of marriage and childbearing. So it's no longer first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes the baby and the baby carriage, right? But it's a variety of kind of pathways that people might take, and varying transitions between being single, cohabiting, maybe returning to singlehood, right? Moving to cohabitation again, maybe marriage, maybe fertility first, then marriage. So, again, more diverse pathways than in the past. And so generally what we've been saying and what you've been reading about is that cohabitation rates are increasing and marriage rates are decreasing. And we'll talk more, we'll get into some more data about that. But I did just want to point out that the Pew Research Center is suggesting that cohabitation rates have really plateaued, that they're no longer going up. So we're going to have to kind of keep our eye and ear out for that research in our family studies literature. Okay, so this is from the U.S. Census Bureau Current Population Survey, and this is really showing us the trend, the downward trend to marriage rates and the upward trend in cohabitation. And now, as you can see, a higher proportion of emerging adults are cohabiting than they are living with a partner, which makes sense because the average age of first marriage is, I think, above 27 for females. And as we know, cohabitation rates have been increasing and marriage rates have been declining across all adult age groups. And so this just shows us also between ages of 25 and 34. When we look at late 1960s, 1968 was actually the year my parents got married. 80% of all adults at this age were married and living with a spouse, and none were cohabiting pretty much. And now we see, pretty significant shifts. And we can also kind of add up these percentages and note that quite a few young adults are not living with either a cohabiting partner or with a spouse. Okay, let's talk more specifically about marriage rates and why they are declining. Okay, so marriage rates are declining for different gender couples, but as we've talked about, because of the recent legalization of same-gender couple marriage in the United States, we've seen, or national legalization, I should say, we've seen a dramatic increase in the marriage rates for same-sex or same-gender couples. So when we're talking about declining marriage rates, we're talking about that for different gender couples. So the reasons why marriage rates are declining for different gender couples are that we are both delaying marriage and also never getting married. So in terms of the delaying marriage piece, the majority of never married adults still report wanting to get married someday. So it's not as much that people don't believe in marriage anymore or don't aspire towards marriage. But they are delaying kind of when they're doing it. And interestingly, they're not delaying partnering. So it's not like they're eschewing romantic relationships or sexual intimacy. They are forming unions, but just usually in cohabitation, not in marriage. So the age of union formation has remained about the same, even though marriage is getting delayed. Before we go on, though, let's talk about who's not delaying marriage. Who's still getting married early, like before 24, perhaps. And those are emerging adults with parents without college degrees, those who are living in the South or rural areas, which are often also those that have more conservative Protestant religion, also conservative, or also I should say Mormon religion. Military service members are more likely to marry younger, and whites and Latinos or Chicanos. So you're less likely to marry early if you're African American or Asian American, if one or both of your parents have a college degree, and if you live in a more urban or suburban environment. And waiting until you're 21 to get married really does decrease the likelihood of divorce. Okay. So why are marriage rates declining for different gender couples? So first, we have what's called the deinstitutionalization of marriage. And so that's because we are now offering alternatives to marriage and adult status. So marriage isn't the only way to become an adult in our society, and we don't have as much a stigma for being unmarried or single. So we used to use words like bachelor, spinster, old maid, washed up. There was this fear if you got to a certain age and you weren't married, then, your chances were over. I remember actually my dad working with a man who was unmarried, and, I was born in 1972, so in the late 1970s and early 80s, when John would come over to our house, I just thought it was so weird that he wasn't married. And I remember my parents saying, because I was confused, they were saying things like, he's a bachelor, right? Which was a really unusual kind of concept for me. Okay, so marriage rates also might be declining, or likely declining, because we have had several decades of high divorce rates. Divorce, as we're going to see, isn't still increasing, but it's high. And it is actually increasing for some subpopulations, as we'll talk about, even though not for the general population. And so people are afraid potentially of divorce, and so they are delaying marriage or never marrying. And then economics is a really big factor. In terms of declines in marriage rates, we see steeper declines for lower socioeconomic status individuals, so people who have less money and less education. The way that I make sense of this is marriage seems to be associated with financial stability and commitment, and so people are not wanting to do that if they don't they're not wanting to commit if it's a financially unstable situation. And the reason why we are seeing steeper declines for working class individuals is that working class men, different sex, who would potentially, let me back up, heterosexual working class men are basically less marriageable. They've had, their wages have stagnated, they've had higher rates of unemployment, rising incarceration, as we'll talk about. And so this leads to declining marriageability. And then we have more working class heterosexual women who are working and who are educated, and so are less likely to need to partner with a man in order to have kind of financial security. And so they may delay marriage until they can find a partner who offers that financial stability. Okay, so it's been suggested that in order to reach the marriageability bar, you have to have at least 4 out of 7 of these kind of economic factors. In order to be marriageable, you have to have health insurance or a bank account, home ownership, not be dependent upon TANF or what's known as, formerly known as welfare. You can't have had a really rough economic past year. You need to be showing kind of some earnings growth so that you're earnings, your wages haven't stagnated, but they're continuing to rise, and you have a history of steady employment. And so again, you don't have to have all 7 of those, but you've got to have at least 4 of them. Okay, so Cohen and Pepin did a research study kind of investigating marriage markets for Black and white women in more urban areas. And what they found, first is that they just recognized that we have this increasing marriage gap between Black and white individuals. Marriage rates for both groups are declining, but declining at a steeper rate for Black men and women, and this is women who are depicted here in this graph, than it is for white men and women. And so their research investigated kind of the amount of what's the sex ratio, or the amount of unmarried Black marriageable men available for Black women, assuming that they want to marry basically endogenously within their own racial classification. And so the number of unmarried Black men is quite a bit lower than white men. And we can make sense of this in a few different ways, but one of the important ones is incarceration, which we've talked about previously, because incarceration rates have dramatically increased, especially for young Black men over the last 5 decades. This is severely correlated with a reduction in income, assets, and is associated with a lower marriage rate. And so basically straight Black women who want to marry Black men face a really tough marriage market. Okay, so let's move into talking about cohabitation. So I think most of this will be a review from findings that we've already talked about in this class. So generally we talk about cohabitation rates as increasing, but again, some Pew data is suggesting that perhaps those have been stabilizing. People are more likely to cohabit if they have less education and lower income. Cohabitation has become so normal in the last several decades that now we're at the point where most married couples cohabit first. However, interestingly, most cohabiting relationships do not end in marriage anymore, so it's not always just this stop, in the march to marriage. Yet it is more likely to lead to marriage if a person has higher education, or the partners have higher education. We've talked about this a little bit already, that we used to see a very strong link between cohabitation and divorce. They used to be very correlated because both cohabitation and divorce were increasing in the 1970s and 1980s. But once divorce began to plateau in the 80s and cohabitation began to keep increasing, then that correlation got a lot weaker. And now it's really almost disappearing. And in fact, some groups will show a cohabitation benefit, basically that if you cohabit first, you're less likely to divorce should you get married later. So cohabitation, like we've talked about, is complex. Not everybody's doing it for the same reasons. Some of our readings this week talked about how in European countries cohabitation is more of a kind of substitute or alternative for marriage, but here in the United States we have a number of different reasons why people cohabit. So the first one is this idea of it's more of a trial or a precursor to marriage. It used to be that people would maybe perhaps be engaged before they cohabited, but that's less of the case now. But people might be planning on getting married, maybe planning on getting engaged, but they're kind of trying it out, or they're living together while they're engaged, or leading up to the time that they're going to get married. And this is more typically for younger cohabitors. And then we have people who don't have plans to get married. Maybe because they've been divorced in the past and they feel they got burned, or they're worried about getting divorced, and so they are happy just cohabiting without a plan for marriage. So again, less cohabitors are getting married than in the past, and this is more likely for women with less education and also for older cohabitors. So my father-in-law, who had been married and divorced twice, brought kind of a serious girlfriend to visit us, a number of years ago, and they were wearing rings on their left hands, and so we immediately asked, "Oh my gosh, are you engaged?" He said, "Oh no, we're not engaged, we're entangled." right? Because they didn't want to take on kind of everything that came with marriage and its legalities, and especially being older, that changes kind of your how your estate gets divided after you die and all those kinds of things. And then this is a great point that many people are now using cohabitation basically as a form of intensive dating. And this move, in a dating relationship into cohabiting can happen pretty quickly, within a few months for many couples. Sometimes this is more kind of intentional because, you really matter to me, I really like you, we want to, kind of take our relationship to the next level. And sometimes it's more of a slide or a drift into cohabitation because, oh my gosh, your place is closer to where I go to school or where I work, and so it's just easier because I was staying here anyway, or I don't like my roommate, or something like that. Generally, research in the past has said that cohabiting with a commitment has better kind of long-term outcomes than cohabiting for convenience or for economics. So when you're cohabiting for kind of commitment, that's more likely to either lead to marriage, or if you do get married, less likely to lead to divorce. But cohabiting out of convenience and this idea of serial cohabitation, perhaps out of convenience, has been kind of correlated with less stable relationship outcomes. But again, that could be changing. Okay, so let's talk about cohabitation, childbearing, and child rearing a little bit more, right? As we talked about, more people are having babies without being married, and so that increase in non-marital births is really due to the increase in births to cohabiting couples, not as much increasing births to just single women, for example. And I thought it was interesting that Sassler and Leichter pointed out that pregnancy is more likely now to trigger cohabitation than marriage. So we used to hear this term shotgun wedding, and now it's probably more shotgun cohabitation. And also, as we've talked about already, this is a kind of a relatively new term, multi-partner fertility, basically having children with several different, or more than one, I should say, biological partner is increasing. So people might have children resulting from several cohabitating or marital unions. Okay, so now let's talk about relationship quality and dissolution. And so this actually kind of ties into upcoming material on relationship dissolution and divorce. But cohabiting couples, have generally reported lower relationship quality, and that's been a fairly stable finding, although it might be that gap is narrowing between married couples and cohabiting couples. But this is in part because cohabiting couples who do have high relationship quality are more likely to marry. I mean, not all, you could be a cohabiting couple with high relationship quality and decide not to marry, but if you're on the fence about marriage or not, if your relationship quality is lower, then you're not going to marry. And so that kind of leads to a selection bias, essentially, that people who select into marriage are going to have higher relationship quality. Not necessarily that marriage makes them have higher relationship quality. And cohabiting relationships also have higher dissolution or breakup rates for the same reasons, right? Because maybe there wasn't as high relationship quality to start with, or as high of commitment to start with. Perhaps because we weren't using this as a substitute for marriage, we were using it as intensive dating, or we were using it out of convenience. And also because cohabitation is correlated with other risk factors which might increase your risk of relationship dissolution. So economic disadvantage, as we've talked about, lower income marriages are at higher risk for divorce. Economic hardship, can erode psychological well-being and relationship quality, like we've talked about in the family stress model. Cohabitors are more likely to have children from prior relationships, which can create, that kind of creates step family situations, which are typically more stressful. And cohabitors might already be having had a divorce experience. And once you've had one divorce experience, that puts you more at risk for kind of later relationship dissolution.